Welcome, everybody. My name is Emily Torty. I work for Appalachian Sustainable Development as an agroforester, and I am so happy to host you here today for the Ask an Agroforester webinar series. And we'll be introducing Kaitie Adams shortly, but we've got a really great lineup this season and a fun session today. So thanks for joining us. And I just want to take you through a little bit of opening information. And that starts with a big thanks to the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation, whose funding has made this programming possible. So first off, welcome, Kaitie. We'll do her bio and a more thorough welcome later, but I just want to give her an opportunity to say hello so you can hear her lovely voice.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about alley cropping today. So really, really looking forward to this conversation and hopefully doing some demystifying of what can be sort of like a complicated practice, or at least there's a perception of it being a very complicated practice. So, all right, a little bit about ASD. Our mission is to build a thriving regional food and ag system that creates healthy communities, respects the planet, and cultivates profitable opportunities for Appalachians. So our work falls into 5 sort of major areas. We work in workforce development, agriculture education, food access, economic development, and resource conservation. And that 5th bullet is where agroforestry falls. So just a few impacts today. We're an organization that does all kinds of different things, but it's nice to kind of highlight some of the things that we're not necessarily talking about in these webinars, like the work that our food hub does. So to date, we have been able to sell and distribute over $40 million in produce, beef, and value-added products for the food hub. It's pretty sweet. We have helped new gardeners produce over 170,000 pounds of food. We've installed a ton of raised beds in schools and clubs and through our veterans programming, preserved over 5,000 acres of forest land, helped support farmers and natural resources professionals, over 5,000 of them, and been able to donate 10 million pounds of local and regional food to area food pantries. So, you know, like we're kind of a big deal. Just kidding. But there are a ton of exciting things going on at ASD, and it is really fun for me to get to like zoom out and take a minute to think about all the stuff that's going on across programming. If you're more interested in learning about us and learning about the agroforestry program, you can go to our website and you can check out any of the different programs. But if you go to the agroforestry program page, you'll get all kinds of resources and information about different grant programs we're working on, partnerships, etc. And even just resources about what is alley cropping, for example, or any of the different agroforestry practices, nursery lists, all of that kind of stuff can be found on our webpage. We do have a couple of funding opportunities we're working with right now. One is the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program that applies to farmers across the US, so it's countrywide, and any of the 5 agroforestry practices can apply to this program, or anyone working in any of the 5 practices or working on a project that might bleed over across the different divisions between like silvopasture and alley cropping, for example. So that's a great program run through Virginia Tech. Check out Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program if you have a small project you'd like some funding help with. And then also, if you go to workingtrees.com, you can get information about our Assets Grant Program, which is a silvopasture installation program that helps with installation payments for silvopasture and also offers an optional carbon credit, so you can get long-term, like a little long-term trickle of income from the trees that you've planted. We also offer our agroforestry trainings for natural resources professionals. You can find those on the website. You can also go to learnagroforestry.com. There's a really great set of online resources that are self-paced, and you can go through those classes, and they are excellent. I've gotten to go through all of those. And also, if you're interested in that and you're a natural resources person and you would like a little more accountability with going through that curriculum, Jen Ripp, who we'll have on next week, also sort of steers a cohort, like a mastermind cohort, through those a couple times a year. So you can reach out and get involved in that way. Lastly, our Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub is a resource for farmers in southwestern Virginia. This is a shared use space where farmers can get trainings and cost share so that they can learn about knowing how to sustainably harvest and grow their herbs. We also have shared equipment they can use to process their herbs and get them to market. And we also help aggregate sales for folks and find guaranteed buyers so that they can be more successful and profitable in their herb business. Our special guest today, Kaitie Adams, is director of the Demonstration Farm Network at the Savanna Institute. I'm not going to read this whole bio. I'll leave it up for a minute so that you can read it. But I will say Kaitie's work focuses on the way demonstration farms, working farms, and rural communities can come together to make agroforestry possible in the Midwest, which is a very large focus. And I'll let her just introduce herself briefly, and then we'll launch that poll and she can start sharing her screen.
Well, big gratitude to Emily and ASD for inviting me to come talk about alley cropping at any scale today. I am a huge alley cropping woo girl. I've been farming for about 15 years. I started working actually with perennials and then switched to vegetables. And I've been working specifically in alley cropping for just over a decade now. And I'm not a scientist or a researcher. At this point in my life, I'm no longer a farmer, even though I still manage a network of farms and help make decisions on those farms. And I'm far from an expert. I'm constantly learning as we grow these systems, as we learn more about how alley cropping works in different scales, different crops, in different locations. And so I'm here today really to talk about my experience as a practitioner. And so my formal training is in anthropology, so I don't come from an ag background, I don't come from a natural resource background, but I come from a relationships background. And that's been really valuable in agroforestry specifically, and alley cropping even more so, because we're looking at relationships and interactions between different systems, different plants, different people that can work in that. And my love for alley cropping all started when I started working on a farm that was growing vegetables between rows of fruit trees in Ferguson, Missouri at EarthDance Organic Farm School. So I started working there in 2015, the same year that the trees went in the ground. And I'll talk more about that system a little bit later. But I was lucky enough to farm on that land, teach on that land long enough to enjoy the first harvest off the fruit trees that were planted in an alley cropping system. And I was also lucky enough to meet my husband and also get engaged in an alley cropping system. And so my joy and enthusiasm for this practice specifically comes from both experience at a small scale vegetable level, all the way up to 100 plus acres of conventional corn and soybeans and alley cropping. And so I am excited to share today. So I might not have all the answers, but there's also some experts here in the room. So please drop questions and we can make this more of a conversation than just a lecture that I'm giving today. And so I'm sure we're all familiar with kind of the basics of alley cropping, but I'm going to touch it just briefly. Alley cropping, very simply put, is the growing of crops in alleys in between regularly spaced rows of trees and shrubs. So these can be timber trees, they can be fruit trees, they can be floral shrubs. Woody perennials is what we're talking about when we're talking about alley cropping, and then anything growing between those rows in an intentional and intensive way. And so one of the reasons why alley cropping is so exciting to me is it by its very basis just completely destroys our binary thought and our thoughts of separation between what we think the natural world and agriculture should do, what the difference is between agriculture and conservation. All of these things just sort of like get combined together into one functional system. And so when we think about the natural world, we often think of it as something that's set to the side, which we all know is not true because many of us here are farmers and we work in that system every day. And when it comes to conservation here in real crop country where I live, often that's like a filter strip or a grass buffer or something on the edge of the field. It's something you do on the outside. But alley cropping invites us and also teaches us that agriculture, conservation, and what we think of as the natural world are all one and the same and can be combined in one system. And we'll see how that really comes together through the examples that I'm going to share today. And so just some basic terminology. I like the USDA Center for Agroforestry's terminology with alley cropping. The alley is the production that's happening in between the rows of trees. That production is called the alley crop. And then the woody perennials, often trees, are the tree row. And then pretty basic kind of production and agroforestry naming, like within row spacing. If we're talking about within row spacing, we're talking about the distance between rows of trees. We're talking about alley width or length. That's really specific to the alley. So alleys and tree rows is really what we're talking about with alley cropping. And there's lots of different reasons why folks might be interested in alley cropping. One of the ones that I hear the most talking with growers and their folks that are interested in this practice is diversity and resilience. Folks that are looking to transition annual systems to perennial systems or combine those two together. My colleague MJ often describes alley cropping as being able to have both an annual checking account and then a 401k within the same field. So your checking account or your cash crops, that could be corn, soybeans, vegetables, cut flowers, anything medicinals that you're growing that maybe can take you get annual income off of. And then your tree rows are your long-term savings accounts. For some things like fruits or nuts, that's more like a savings account. For things like timber production, that's more like a 401k. You can stack systems together within one space. So you're able to utilize the canopy as well as the understory and really reap the benefits of those things, which help mitigate risk on the farm. So the more you diversify, the more that you're basically building out an insurance program for yourself with multiple crops that have different needs and different timelines, which can help with long-term changes, especially with climate, but with weather events, rain, humidity, those sort of things, or crop failure as well, and allows for succession to happen over time, which I know we're going to talk about more later. Microclimates are also a benefit of adding trees in there. We have some shading effects. We have some wind protection, depending on where you're at, that come in with alley cropping systems, and we add those trees in. And of course, trees are really efficient at increasing carbon storage, both within their biomass as well as in the soil, and can help store carbon at deeper soil horizons. And they improve nutrient cycling just by their benefit of being a tree, where they're able to uptake excess nutrients and then put it into their leaf systems, drop the leaves, and then allow for those to cycle through the system again. Trees also help with water, and I mentioned nutrient management, to be able to uptake or stop the spread of some of those things. And trees and shrubs are also really great habitat, especially with you're in communities or systems where there's not a lot of other habitat happening, such as this corn system that you see on the screen here. But for me, one of the most exciting things about alley cropping is it's scalable AF. And I mean that in two different ways. It's scalable agroforestry, and it's also scalable AF. And you can infer the word I'm trying to say with that other F in there. And so you might be asking, like, what scales are we talking here? And so I'm going to lay out some case studies of farms that range from 5 acres to over 100 acres on what alley cropping can look like within those farms. And so we're going to see a cut flower farm, we're going to see 2 vegetable farms, and then 2 larger scale grain systems where we're going to dig in. And I'm going to talk from my own experience. All of these systems are ones that I've either helped design or have done work on, have managed. And so these are ones that I'm intimate with. There are hundreds and thousands of different examples of alley cropping, both here in the United States and around the world, both now and over time. And so I'm just going to focus on my experience rather than giving you kind of a large survey of what alley cropping can be. And so the first farm that I'm going to highlight is Delight Flower Farm in Champaign, Illinois. This is an amazing farm that's owned by Maggie Taylor and operated by an amazing group of women here in East Central Illinois. And they have an annual cut flower alley cropping system where they've added woody perennials into their business. And so Maggie and her crew run a CSA. They do wholesale orders, they do education and teach classes on their farms. And then Maggie also helps other farmers as they're getting going with their operation. When Maggie and I first chatted about alley cropping, her goals were production diversification, habitat creation, especially for pollinators and beneficial insects, to be able to use microclimates and kind of create those on a pretty small scale. The footprint of her farm is 5 acres, and so she doesn't have much room to play around with. Climate, helping with carbon sequestration and doing more to mitigate and adapt to our climate crisis. And then, of course, for a flower farm, beauty is a big one. And so what was decided for the alley cropping system on this farm was to work just on 1/3 of an acre. That was part of one of 2 major growing fields for Maggie that she has in addition to multiple high tunnels. And that was a sort of something that she felt really comfortable with working with. Some risk for a new practice, didn't throw it all in because it was something that she was learning how to do. The orientation of the rows are west to east because that was the orientation of the kind of permanent raised beds that she was already working with. And so when thinking about kind of a market garden setup, taking permanent beds and shifting the production from annual to perennial is one easy way to integrate alley cropping within that, because you already have your row system, your pathway system set up, and then you can figure out how to layer the perennials on top of the annual production that's already happening. For Maggie, that meant her alley widths were 19 to 23.5 feet, depending on what was already existing in the field. And the row length was 100 feet, which had already been standardized by how she was already growing. And because she was putting perennials into an already existing annual system, her row width is 3 feet, which is very, very, very small. We'll talk more about spacing a little bit later, but that doesn't leave much room for the perennials to grow. You're going to lose footpath space, and it's going to take over multiple beds. But we talked about some of those considerations, and Maggie's been doing a really great job over the years since she established in 2023, figuring out how that works within her production systems, which means like a little bit of extra pruning, which her use of woodies within her flower arrangements at CSA, and wreath making makes sense, especially with things like dogwood, elderberry, arrowwood, winterberry, and holly, which are the woody perennials that she went with. Maggie also did this through an NRCS equip contract. And so NRCS was able to cost share this, and the NRCS resource conservationist came out to the farm and we all walked around and talked about what was possible. And Maggie is an amazing educator, so follow her on Instagram or Facebook and learn a lot from what she's doing out there. Okay, second farm, a little bit bigger. So Sola Gratia Farm in Urbana, Illinois. They're an annual vegetable farm, and until this point had only been growing annual vegetables for over the past decade. They were doing so on rented land, and so had almost no perennials as part of their production, except for some strawberries and blackberries and things like that. But a couple of years ago, they were able to purchase land for the first time. And once that purchase went through, they were immediately interested in adding more perennials to their operation. Sola Gratia is a nonprofit farm with a mission of feeding folks within their community. So they donate about 1/3 of their production to feeding programs, free markets, local soup kitchens, as well as employ lots of teenagers, do farm to school work, and then also have a CSA, sell at local markets, and then also sell onto the Chicago market. In all transparency, this is the farm my husband manages. We met at EarthDance. He learned a lot about how we were doing our alley cropping out there. Had run an apple orchard for many years, and once they were able to purchase land, knew immediately that they wanted to add perennials to the farm and that he wanted to do it in alley cropping system. So he came to the table already knowing exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to add perennials for production diversification. Folks that they work with in the community, both in their CSA and as part of free markets and feeding programs, had been asking specifically for fruit. Folks love fruit, kids love fruit. It's a great gateway and an opportunity to be able to get nutrient-dense food to folks. And so fruit had to be a focus of what they were doing because they're also growing a lot of vegetables and they need to keep up at a particular scale. Soil health, microclimate, pollination, and beneficial insects were a major focus for them. They were interested also in the climate adaptation and mitigation side of things. And because John is the farm manager, has a passion for apple production and had run an apple orchard in his own farm business for over half a decade, this was an opportunity for him to bring that joy and part of his life onto this farm. And so what they decided is to spread the alley cropping across multiple acres of the farm. And John used this opportunity also to use the tree rows to block out half-acre vegetable blocks. This was not only helpful for crop planting, but also allowed him to start thinking through multi-year rotations of crops, cover cropping, fallow land in a way that was more systematic. The orientation of most of the rows are north to south, with the exception of an area on the northwest side of the farm, which is west to east, because one, because of the way that that section was, and two, because there was some water that runs from that side of the farm that they wanted to help mitigate. The alley widths are 93 feet, which fit within their raised bed and pathway system. It's kind of a wonky number, but it fit their equipment. It fit the growing beds they're already utilizing, and so kept with that. The row length is standardized across the field, and then the row widths themselves, so the tree row widths are 16 feet, much bigger than what Maggie was working with. But 16 feet allowed for the trees to be in the middle, which is part of a one row system, and then allowed for the equipment they were going to use for mowing and other equipment passes to be able to get in. And so they have a really diverse species list of both bush fruit, one nut, they have some hazelnuts in there, but mostly tree fruit. And this tree fruit is on semi-dwarfing rootstock, which means that they're going to top out anywhere between 15 to 20-ish feet tall and have a more compact limb spread than if we were to put say standard size trees within this system. So thinking about both the canopy size as well as the rooting structure is important for alley cropping systems. Okay, I mentioned EarthDance Organic Farm School at the beginning of this presentation. This is really where I cut my teeth on alley cropping. This is where I saw its major benefits. I saw the system transition over time and have just been continually impressed with how this system has continued to develop since 2015 when the first trees went into the ground. I knew this as a perennial permaculture orchard. I didn't know it was called alley cropping until I left EarthDance and started working for Savanna Institute. And what they did on this farm was very similar to what John did at Sola Gratia. But what they were able to do was take the full 14 acres of the farm, put about 5 acres focus on 5 acres of their vegetable production to add trees in. And one of the things that was really helpful for them in this system is it's a farm that has a slope where water was continually running downhill. And so the farm was on a hill of about a 6% slope, so not nothing. And so water would move from the top of the farm to the bottom. And so one of the main motivators for this system, beyond some of the motivators or goals that we saw from both Delight and Sola Gratia, was they wanted to stop, slow, and spread out water as it was coming across the farm. And so these trees were put in a north to south orientation, and they have a swale that's upslope, and then the trees are planted on a berm. Over time, some of those swales have filled in, and the berm has kind of mounted up a little bit, which has actually been fine for the tree production, with some kind of modifications over time to help keep the water management of the farm keeping on pumping. And so for EarthDance, they had at the time when I was working there, they had a permanent no-till raised bed system. And so the alley width and the row width of the trees were really calculated to keep that production going for as long as possible, and knowing that there might be some production dips or losses over time as the trees continue to grow. This farm also had trees that were focused on fruit that could be shared and distributed within the local community through their farmers market, through their donation programs, through their farm to school work. And so because this is in Missouri, we see the entry of things like plums and figs and peaches that are a little bit more challenging to grow where I am in central Illinois, and where we're doing most of our work. One of the biggest things besides the water management that I've seen at EarthDance over the years is the increase in beneficial insects, especially parasitoid wasps, from having the fruit trees and also other herbaceous perennials, particularly with umbral flowers, that can be really helpful in keeping pest and disease pressure down. And then also helpful with beneficial microclimates of the heat of the summer to be able to grow more tender things like salad greens that tend to want to bolt really quickly in the heat and humidity. Okay, last couple of farms that I'm going to run through quickly, because these are mostly from my context here in East Central Illinois and might not be as applicable to where you are or where you are joining in from. And these are a couple of examples from annual grain systems, mostly working with conventional grain systems here in East Central Illinois. 75% of our land in Illinois is in ag. The majority of that is in corn and soybean production. And so most of my work is focused on how alley cropping can help shift the production modes of the majority of the landscape here in Illinois, which means working very closely with very conventionally minded grain growers who are very skeptical about alley cropping and very skeptical about trees in general. And so this is one of our demonstration farms here in Monticello, Illinois. This is the Savanna Institute demo farm. And I transitioned from my alley cropping work at EarthDance directly into working into this system. So very different, but many of the same principles applied. And so for this farm, we were also interested in water management because there was water running across the field. We were interested in climate mitigation, wildlife habitat, and specifically soil health, because that's a big buzzword everywhere, but specifically within more conventional row crop communities right now, and for good reason. We need to be treating our soils like the essential foundational things that they are. And so this is 35 acres, which can be on the larger side for smaller scale production, but is actually very small for grain production. We oriented these tree rows from west to east to help stop the flow of water that was running from north to south across this farm. We have 200 feet between our tree rows. 200 feet accommodates both the planters, the combine, as well as the sprayers that are used within the system. And we designed it specifically around the equipment and the cropping pattern of the row crop farmer that we work with. The row lengths vary because, as you can see, it's kind of a weirdly shaped field. And then our row widths are 30 feet. And so things are a little bit different here because we have 3 rows of trees within our tree row instead of 1 row of trees or perennial or woody perennials in the other examples that we've seen so far. We did 3 rows because we're interested in playing around with the possibility of timber production We're also interested in learning about how trees share nutrients and water, and if there's any benefit of multi-row systems within agroforestry. And we also wanted to see the wildlife as well as kind of the nutrient cycling benefits and soil health benefits of multiple tree rows. And so the trees out here are longer term trees, mostly playing around with seeing if we can do timber production and alley cropping. And those are swamp white oak, shagbark hickory, black walnut, black locust, and a mix of other sort of native mid-canopy trees that are native and adapted to this area. You'll notice that this is surrounded by woodlands, and these are all trees in the alley cropping system that you would find within those restored woodland areas as well. So that was kind of our first alley cropping demo farm here in Central Illinois. And our second one that was planted in 2022, first one was planted in 2020. This one went in the ground in 2022, is much larger. It's about double the amount of size, still working with corn and soybean systems. However, this one, our orientation is north to south, which is providing more even shading as the sun is coming across the horizon. We have variable alley width. In the other example, it was standardized. Here, we're looking at the differences between 60-foot alleys all the way up to 180-foot alleys to see the differences within that. We're also playing around with 1-row and 3-row tree row systems within this because research, science, that's demonstration. That's part of the reason SI does all of this work. And our row lengths are standardized at 900 feet. And then in this system, like the one I just showed before, we have headlands at the end for equipment turnaround because equipment is key within alley cropping systems. Similar species within this system of the native hardwoods that we're looking to experiment with. And then very quickly at the end here, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the companion of the grain alley cropping out at Hudson Farm in Urbana is our all perennial alley cropping with fruits and nuts. Because we strive to be a one-stop shop, especially Hudson, which is 120 acres of former corn and soybean land, we wanted to do both tree crop production alley cropping as well as conventional grain alley cropping. And so this system size is 30 acres, has the north to south orientation already. Our alley widths range from 12 to 15 feet. That's actually not right. They range from 32 feet to 25 feet. Sorry for that typo. I'll fix that before we send it out. Where if you look on the left, we have a hazelnut system that has 25 feet of what we call conventional ground cover in between rows of hazelnuts, as well as 20 feet of pollinator habitat. And so that's like kind of more of a conservation alley cropping system. And then over here on the right-hand side, we have heart nuts or Japanese walnuts, and growing in between them are 3 rows of either elderberry, which you can see the elder flower here, or black currant. And so the nuts are our tree rows. The 3 rows of berry production is our alley or alley crop. And then that repeats across the field. And so I'm going to end, and I think I already went over time, by just sharing a lot of gratitude for all the folks that have made these alley cropping systems work. So many people aren't even shown on these slides, but the great thing about alley cropping is you can't do it by yourself in many ways. And so I've been lucky that all the systems that we've shown so far have been multi-party systems with lots of partners and many folks that have made them possible. So with that, I'll stop now and we can get the party started.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kaitie. And I see all our little like celebratory emojis reactions coming through. I think it is so cool to get to see all the different scales and even like scaling up all the way through like fully perennial. So thank you for showing all that. Yeah, I have more to say, but we're gonna get the party started. So, with our little vibe shift activity, we'll do a couple quick fire questions that are just like for funsies. So we just got through Halloween. What's your favorite guilty pleasure Halloween candy?
Ooh, that's a hard question. Um, I really like Mary Jane's, even though that's usually not like everyone's favorite, like the peanut butter taffy. But I
Oh,
didn't get
I don't even know
any.
what that is.
Yeah, they're peanut butter taffy that used to be
Okay.
really popular, at
Okay.
least where I grew up in Southern Illinois. Or maybe not popular, but lots of people gave them out.
Let's not
Um,
get carried away.
but this year I've liked eating Smarties. Like
Oh, yeah.
Willow's happy, my daughter's happy to share her Smarties, and so I'm like, oh, these are good. They're kind of good.
And to stay on the Halloween vibe, did you see any like particularly excellent Halloween costumes this year? Or any year, like any that stand out for you?
Yeah, I'm really lucky that my best friend is an amazing seamstress, and
Ooh.
she always creates awesome, uh, awesome costumes for a kid. And she created a dragon this year with like shiny scales and this beautiful tail that I'm just like always impressed by.
Nice. I saw, speaking of Halloweens and dragons, I saw on a Willow account I follow, I can't remember whose it was, but someone had woven this like incredibly intricate dragon head all out of willow, and it was pretty insane.
That's amazing.
Yes. So this is the niche Instagram stuff that I follow. Do you want to leave your screen up in case it's relevant, or do you want to stop sharing? What feels?
Um, I might leave it up because I have some reference slides if there's questions that I can go back to, but it's up to you,
Love it.
really.
So we're just going to do this first 15 minutes of sort of like pre-prepared questions, and then we'll get into the audience questions. I see some really good ones already coming in, so please hop over there as questions arise. But so let's talk spacing considerations in alley cropping systems. That's our first question. What are the major considerations, and especially thinking about like, thinking maintenance. And I think also in-row maintenance, because I think that people are good about thinking about that between maintenance, but not necessarily like in-row over time.
Yeah. Um, I'm so glad we're going to get into some of these specific questions because I glossed over so much in my presentation. But the spacing is really key for alley cropping. And this is where design is really vital for setting up alley cropping systems. Because you want spacing that works for you during planting and the establishment years, you have to have spacing that works for you during the, 5 to 15 to 20 years where the trees or the shrubs are maturing or you're already starting to harvest to be able to get in, do maintenance, get harvest done. And then you have to think of the spacing as the system changes over time. And so, for example, if we're looking at a system like this at the 4-H Memorial Camp Farm, um, you can already see, let's see if I can annotate here. Oops, sorry. Sorry for the people on YouTube. You can already see
We can
that
edit.
these trees here um, are already starting to mature. These are black locust trees. These went in 2020. This picture was taken in 2024. They're already starting their canopy. And so the spacing on this 3-row system was uh, we have the row crop and then 5 feet of ground cover, the tree, 10 feet of ground cover, the middle row of trees, 10 feet of ground cover, um, the last row of trees, and then another 5 foot until the crop or the edge of the field. That 5 feet was perfect in, the first 5 years or so as the trees were growing. We were able to get a mower through there. They were laid out with GPS, and so our farmer partner knew exactly where he was supposed to be. We knew exactly where we were supposed to be. We had a perennial rye, Dutch white clover, perennial ryegrass ground cover that was easy to see and really mark out where that was. And we've been able to get in, maintain everything during establishment years, no problem. But that canopy is starting to grow now. It's starting to shade out some of the crop that's adjacent to it. And it's getting harder during the growing season to get in between the tree and the crop itself. And so one of the reasons why we have 200 feet is because it matches a 40-foot planter and combine as well as a 90-foot sprayer, but it also gives us some wiggle room to play around with so that if we wanted to extend the sort of what I sometimes call the tree block or like the area where the trees are growing, we can extend the ground cover into the row crop and take that out of his lease. And so we can give ourselves more opportunity and more space to get in, do maintenance, do pruning, do what we need to do. But it allows for him to have that extra production in the establishment years where it's not an issue, and then take it out of his lease as the trees mature. And so that sort of flexibility with spacing is really important. Where that becomes more challenging, oh no, it's still on the screen. Um, where that can become more challenging is in a system like at Delight Flower Farm, where we just took out or transitioned one annual production row into perennial row, and the shrubs are going to start to overlay the pathways, which is hard to get in and prune or do anything else. And you can see these these elderberry over here on this part of on the right side of that picture is already overlaying the footpath and then going into the growing bed right here. And so that's made a logistical challenge for Maggie to be able to get in and grow anything in that row. You're basically can only harvest or do work from one side, which is challenging. And so that production bed is basically gonna have to come out over time. And so that can be a plus or a minus depending on what your longer term plans are for that field. But in my experience over the past decade with alley cropping, giving yourself more space in the beginning, while you might be seeing a decrease in production from whatever's happening in the alleys, that space gives you a lot of area to be able to get equipment in, make better choices, stage harvesting. And so I always suggest that you err on like the larger side of things when it comes to in-row spacing than not. And then also with the alley size, what John did, I think, was really interesting by creating these half-acre blocks that were an easy sort of acreage to be able to calculate, to be able to crop plan for, to do particular things for. And so thinking about how easy it is to think about how to standardize those alley widths, what that means for your production, can be really helpful. And over time, for a system like EarthDance, those trees are going to start shading out some of that crop, which means that you can just go ahead and take that out of production and know that your perennial production is going to make up for any free or any annual production bed that might have been there. And that also allows you to extend your maintenance path as well, while still having enough production within the middle to be able to make that happen. But it all depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to transition a space fully into a perennial orchard, you don't care about keeping stuff high production in the middle. And so, for example, at Hudson and the elderberry and black currants, like we know that these heart nuts, the canopy will eventually close. And we'll do thinning within row because we have the in-row spacing is 15 feet. And we know we'll have to prune over time. But we're not interested in having, I know we're not interested in having those elderberry and black currants produce for the next 40 years. We just want them to produce for the next 10 to 15 years. And then we can bring in livestock into the system. We can think about haying it. We can think about just transitioning into a nut production orchard. And so we're already thinking in the future. And so our spacing is both for now, for production, and then, 40, 50 years down the line.
Awesome. So my phone just like has never talked to me before, but just like started talking to me. He was like, that sounds fascinating. So sorry, I just had to share that. Even my phone thinks this is fascinating. Uh,
Fascinating.
um, but I do want to piggyback. So looking at the Q&A, there are two questions that like fall right into what you're talking about here. And some of this one you've already answered. I'm just going to read it in full anyway. But it says, have you had farms that expanded tree row width into the alleys after a few years, widening tree rows while narrowing alleyways? So we did talk about that. But like one tree line becomes three tree lines within a row, for example, or adding another tree row into the center of an alley. I just want to, since we're right on that topically, just give you a chance
Yeah,
to hit any of that.
great question. I think that the best thing we can do for ourselves when designing, especially larger scale alley systems, is give yourself as many opportunities to make changes over time as possible. And so, for example, a 4-H Memorial Camp Farm, 200 feet is our alley width. When we were designing this at Savanna Institute and working with our row crop farm partner, there was some internally within SI, there was some back and forth around like, is it even alley cropping if there's 200 feet between the rows of trees?
Mm-hmm.
Um, from like the scientific research and some of those definitions of what we think of as like the benefit of alley cropping over time, there's kind of a peak and then a drop off of where we get the most benefit. And so 200 feet is really stretching it. We are not really getting the benefits of the trees throughout the entire alley at 200 feet. I think that's okay for larger scale alley cropping systems because you're getting something going that's going to have broad impact across the field, especially if you're thinking about carbon sequestration, habitat, those sort of things. But there's lots of reasons we want 200 feet. And one of them is so that we could eventually add another row of trees over time. And so with a sprayer that's 90 feet wide, if we took out 20 feet of that 200 feet and added one row of trees right in the middle, so adding oh gosh, this is not straight at all. Um, if we added a row of trees right there and with 10 feet spacing on either side of the trees for our ground cover, we could add another row of trees in here and that would fit the 40-90 equipment sizes. Now, that wouldn't be true over the whole length of time, but by adding another, row of trees in there, it goes 90 on one side, 90 of the other. That canopy is going to close a little quicker. It'll force decisions to be made differently within the field over time. So we might transition to something like hay faster, and our row crop farmer does raise livestock, does have hay ground. That makes sense for him. Or transition to something like an winter annual. So winter wheat, things that do most of its growing when the leaves are off the trees, so shade is less of an issue. That's something that we could do. And so our original plan was to maybe add like a row of northern pecan within here that would have both a nut production, we hope, within the next, 20 years or so when we have, warm Octobers for good nut fill, or just a really nice tree that also has some timber value to it. But ultimately, we decided not to do that because we're interested in playing around with things like root pruning, adding, oh God, adding more ground cover, extending the ground cover impact into the field. And so, but we've set ourselves up to have options over time. And when working with our row crop partner, that built a lot of trust with him as well to know that he's not, where both of us aren't tied to the system forever. We can make adjustments over time as needed. And so I think that's also true of both Sola Gratia and Delight. EarthDance is pretty locked into that system. They're not really interested in adding more besides taking rows out of production. But give yourself as much wiggle room to make those decisions over time as you can.
Well, and I like that case study so much because it kind of highlights the inherent flexibility of alley cropping, but it also gives a reality check to like, but also math and planning.
Yeah.
uh,
And also
It'll be
sometimes,
flexible within your bounds if you take enough time in design.
yeah. And sometimes things don't work. And so you have to change it anyway. Alley
Mhm.
cropping, especially at a grain scale, is a big question mark on if it will work and become viable. Um, and oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh, and we often think of trees and perennials as like these immovable, permanent things that we often, as agroforesters, think of as a plus sign for trees. Like, yes, this is why we use trees. They're a permanent agriculture. This is what we want. But for annual production focused farmers, trees, that's one of the reasons why they are scared of them, don't want to work with them, is because it removes flexibility from the system. So the more that we can add the flexibility in, the more we are opening up opportunities to work with annual focused growers.
So, this is still a little within this space. If you want to go back to the slides from Maggie's, this question is, are Maggie's dogwoods and elderberries coppiced each year? And, could that help keep the shrubs from covering the multiple beds and let the light in?
Oh, wrong way. Yes, Maggie does coppice every year on those things and also prunes them very hard during the growing season. And so for the elderberry, I was trying to find a picture from Maggie's Instagram to throw on here. Um, but they've been doing a lot of pruning this season. And so one of the things that Maggie and I have been talking through this year is it's been a lot, it's been more work than she anticipated, because she's trying to manage the interactions between the elderberry, which has like thrived on her farm, just like absolutely taken off, but it's, adjacent to her dahlia beds that are, a high income maker for her. They do utilize the elderflower and elderberry within herbal products that they make and then sell them off the farm. But it's been, even though we talked about, how tall and wide things are going to get, I think it was, I understand what that meant as a agroforester and someone that works with perennials, but
Mhm.
sometimes that can be hard to visualize for folks that aren't used to working with those crops, or perennials in general. And so this has been something that she's been troubleshooting with her crew that we have talked through, around that. But the dahlias that are adjacent to the elderberry, and she's, has a lot of questions around this about why this is, have been doing much better and have less pest and disease pressure than those that are in a different part of the farm. So there's something happening within that impact area of the farm that's been beneficial, but it's like this balance that they're still trying to figure out.
So I guess that brings me to then the next question, is is alley cropping always going to need to be thought of as a transition scheme in some way? Or like, is there an alley cropping that you can really think of as a static system?
Yeah, I don't think any agroforestry system is a static system, but there are ones that are like more permanent than others. And so I think, what's happening at Sola Gratia, and what's happening at EarthDance are good examples of they know where those tree rows are. They know what's going to happen with the vegetables over time. They know they're going to continue to grow vegetables in between the rows of trees. And so that's just kind of a given. Like they're never going to transition it to hay ground. They may eventually, but not in the plans, transition it to like other perennial crops over time. But for the most part, like they still get the majority of their production and their education from vegetable production. And so that's going to continue to be a main focus of the farm.
Okay, so last question before we transition into all audience questions. Anything you want to shout out to where alley cropping works especially well or is maybe especially contraindicated?
Ooh, can you define contraindicated? I don't think I know
Maybe
the
doesn't
definition
work
of
well.
that. Oh, it doesn't work well.
Is not called
Yes.
for. Fancy
New
words.
vocab word. I love it. Okay. Um, I think that alley cropping works really well within, and this is my bias, right? I think it can work really well within vegetable systems. If you have the capacity, the land footprint, and the desire to do it. Growing vegetables is very hard. The cycles and like the constant production that you have to do is very hard. You already are growing a huge diversity of crops for your market mostly. And so you have to want to add the trees, you have to want to know where it's going, you have to want to do the work. Most vegetable farmers need some rest in the winter, but guess what you got to do in the winter with fruit trees? You got to prune them, which for some folks is exciting. For some folks, that's a nightmare. They just don't want to do it. And there's some, the collision of the annual crop production with when things are coming into production with fruit trees are overlapping. And so by the time you get to like apple, pear, cherry, pawpaw season, you're pretty tired, and then you got to go out and pick trees. But that can also add variety. It could be different. And so, but so I just gave you all the reasons why it doesn't work. But the reason that it does work is because of the benefits to the annual crop. The beneficial insect population increases the diversity of what you can take to market for sale, and people want to buy fruit. They want to buy local fruit.
Mm-hmm.
The market demand is there, and if you grow stuff that people already have familiarity with, um, it can work really well. And then with the microclimate and other benefits, I think this works if you are able to get the spacing, the goals, and the labor figured out. Um, where alley cropping doesn't work well, I would say, is actually in a field like this, where it's a pretty small footprint for an annual grain system. There's a lot of pressure on annual grain producers to be able to get as much production out of their land as possible because of their terrible markets and that they're hamstringed with their price because they're not doing direct sales unless it's organic or another specialty food grade crop. This is just a small acreage. It's already kind of weird shaped. It is creating habitat, but look at all of this habitat around it. Um, like what's the impact on a field like this for alley cropping when it's already small? We have a lot of habitat around it. Maybe this doesn't make sense unless you're using your alley cropping to transition to forest restoration over time, and you're using it as a transition mechanism. However, a farm like this with green alley cropping, there's nothing around it. It is literally corn and soybeans as far as the eye can see. And it's a much larger footprint of a farm. And so that can make more sense. But for most of the grain producers I talk to, they're like, I don't I don't see this ever working for me unless there's a market driver that make me do it or want to do it, or we get the economics right because it just doesn't seem to make sense for those, which is why research and demonstration is our first goal on these farms.
Mm, nice. Okay, so a few quick fun questions and then we're going to dive in. So, favorite non-mechanized and mechanized tool for the farm? I know you say you're no longer a farmer, but you spent a lot of time farming.
Um, I think my favorite non-mechanized tool is a hori hori knife. Just love a hori hori.
Classic.
So versatile,
So versatile.
uh, and so small, so dangerous. Um, And then my favorite mechanized tool, I actually don't like using a lot of mechanized equipment, but I do miss mowing. And I do kind of, which is like I shouldn't like mowing. It's not actually a good ecological thing to do, but it was always a break for me. Like, oh,
Hmm.
I'm gonna take a break. I'm gonna do a little bit of mowing. And I always enjoyed using a walk behind brush hog. I always felt so powerful using one of those, like a
Absolutely.
DR mower.
Heck
It
yeah.
just like kind of felt Mad Max like. And I'm like, wow, this is dangerous. I probably shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, it'll eat it all. It's awesome. All right. So we have a lot of awesome questions. So we'll try to move a little bit quickly. Let's see, this was submitted before the session, so we're going to take it first. And I will actually put the form in the chat too, where y'all can submit questions for upcoming sessions ahead of time if you want to make sure they get answered. Are there specific trees that are contraindicated for alley cropping? For example,
Yeah.
for example, fruit trees, apple question mark. We talked about this a little bit, but or do you need to be even more intentional when planting to avoid becoming an orchard? But let's do the first part of that. Are
Okay.
yeah, any
Great.
trees you would not recommend?
Yeah, this is a great question. Let's see. I'm actually gonna, I have a slide about this. So the answer is yes. And this chart and this illustration come from the USDA National Agroforestry Center. Amazing resource. We should work to support them and keep them protected. But some trees work better than others in alley cropping systems, and it mostly has to do with shade and root competition. And so when we're thinking about what's growing in the alleys, we have to think about how the trees that we're putting in there are impacting. We have to talk about the benefits. We also need to talk about the impact of what's happening to those alley crops. And so we want something that ideal conditions are things that are tap rooted, mostly, that are sending roots into deeper soil horizons that don't have so many lateral roots at the same soil horizon as the annual crop or perennial crop that we're growing in the alleys. And we want something that has medium or oftentimes dappled shade or has um, a predictable sort of like shade impact. And so if you're thinking about orientation, there's a difference between like things like pines, things like conifers, things like apple trees, peach trees, all of those have a different shape and shade impact. And so if we're like the reason that black walnuts often talked about within alley cropping research, specifically with grains and other things that are hay, grain, livestock production, is because it has a low shade production. It has like pretty dappled shade, light's able to filter through, and it has low root competition with adjacent crops. On the other end of that spectrum, we have things like pine, uh, produces a ton of shade, very dense shade. Same thing with oak. And then pine has like medium to high root competition and tend to have more fibrous roots at a higher soil horizon. It tends to be nutrient taking. It's especially in areas where the soils aren't perfect for pine, it's going to be nutrient and water seeking. And so that can be challenging to put in with alley crops. And so I think there's a lot more research that we need on this, specifically with fruit trees, with nut production trees, although there has been some research specifically on nut production. Um, there's been less so with the trees that we don't normally work with in alley cropping systems that I think need a lot more attention, like the horticultural crops of peaches, pears, plums, apples, things that people want to eat that can be grown, but can also be more challenging to grow in alley cropping systems. And so for things like fruit, we're really looking at what type of rootstock that those fruit trees are on, what's happening with the rooting structure. A dwarfed rootstock, which then will need a trellis system and lots of irrigation to produce, is going to have a totally different impact on adjacent crops than like a standard rootstock tree. A dwarf tree is gonna, if it's trellised, it's gonna have its limbs spread out like this. It's gonna not have a lot of shade produced, but really intensive to trellis, to irrigate, to prune. Well, I guess it's a little bit easier to prune actually. But also in terms of sprays, it's going to be more disease susceptible than something on a different rootstock. And so those are some of the things you need to think through, specifically with fruit trees, is what's going on with the roots under the soil, what sort of spray regimes or maintenance regimes does it need, and then how big will the canopy get, and how are you going to do the pruning for both light penetration for the fruit production as well as for shade for the adjacent alley crops. I think it can work. We don't have a lot of best practices on that. There's lots of folks doing this, and we have, I think, a real opportunity to figure that out.
Absolutely. I love when there's just some like straightforward, not necessarily answer, but it's like you've got this nice table. It's like, at least, start with these two things. Start with shade produced
Yeah.
competition. Super helpful. Okay, a couple of very specific tree questions. I know black locust can spread very quickly and become invasive. How do these farms prevent that? Asks Teresa.
Oh, great question. I love black locust. It's a tree that's teaching me a lot. And it's been a really interesting tree to work with in alley cropping systems for lots of different reasons. One, it grows really fast, and so we're seeing that competition much more quickly, or those interactions much more quickly. Two, we're doing a lot of pruning because we're interested in timber, getting timber products like fence posts or other things from these black locusts. And because we're managing them, that means that they are sending lots of suckers out lots of different places. And so there's a couple different ways that we're managing that. So just a heads up, this is a conventional system we're talking about here, which means that there's synthetic chemical management happening both in the crop production, and then we're also, as part of a management trial, using herbicides and things like that. And so because the black locusts are adjacent to a conventionally managed field, there's tillage that happens, which is kind of tillage and chemical management that's happening within the grain system that's actually keeping suckers from growing up within that system. So that's a good and a bad thing. We don't want a bunch of chemical or tillage happening, but that's actually been helpful for keeping suckers out of the field. Suckers are obviously coming up within row with these black locust systems. And so for the most part, it's been fine with mowing and some of the other management that we're doing out there. And we're doing pruning kind of a couple times a year, where we're doing it during dormant season. And then there's one prune that happens during the summer. And so since we're already out there doing that, that's, kind of been keeping things at bay. But it's a higher management system than many folks want to have. But we're monitoring all of this and taking a bunch of notes as well of like what we're doing, what we're seeing. We have an annual black locust monitoring protocol where we're looking at suckering, pod production, thorn production, and then all this kind of standard biometric measurements that we take for trees. And then out here, we're also trialing this next season. We're going to be starting root pruning out here this year. We're taking a deep shank along the sides. We'll start on the south side of each of these tree rows, and we'll move to the north side. So I'm really interested in seeing what happens with suckering once we do the root pruning. I think I know what's going to happen, but we haven't done it yet. And then Canopy Farm Management, who now does all the field work on these farms, is going to trial something called Sucker Punch, which is a synthetic herbicide that is aimed at knocking back suckers, but it's not a systematic herbicide. So shouldn't go into the tree, the trunk, or the main root system of the black locust. I'm skeptical of that. But like the root pruning, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Ooh. Well, we'll have to get a report back next year.
And one last thing I'll share about black locust. Over here, we're very scared of the black locust, even though it's native to Illinois. Um, it's exists here for a very long time. And so we put it on the edges at the end of these tree rows so that if Terry, the natural lands manager of this area over here, or us decided that the black locust wasn't working anymore, we could just take it out. And so we almost have like a veto from
Mm,
multiple parties on the black locust. But 6 years in, no complaints yet.
nice.
Okay.
Um, yeah, you can really see how much in all of these examples, particularly the ones that you've had a hand in, you can see how much communication and upfront work has gone into this. And I appreciate you highlighting some of that and how important it is in the success of these projects. Another quick tree question, tree specific, is are any of your farmers using tree rows as trellis? Grapes, berries, finding things, squash, pumpkins?
I no. The easy answer is no, but I'm interested in knowing how that might work because my experience with that in another system that I managed on the University of Illinois campus is that grapes were choking out the in that system it there was a lot of diversity within row where instead of like most of the systems that we've seen, there's diversity between the alley and the rows themselves, but the rows are pretty standardized where it might be like a row of apple, a row of peaches, a row of plums. Um, Within this U of I site that I was helping manage, the grapes that were planted next to the chestnuts were starting to choke out the chestnuts and it was hard to manage like both the grapes and the chestnuts for maximum sort of like or any production or health because they were very competitive with each other. But that being said, that's been my only experience. And so I'm interested in knowing um, what successful systems are out there because I think that that's a really great utilization of different levels. And so maybe there's an intermediary step where the grapes and the overstory tree can work together in some way, but maybe the chestnut isn't the main trellis system, or there's different types of training that happens. So I'm interested in learning more about that and what's been successful.
Yeah, I'll share. I think that I believe it's Miracle Farm in Quebec, which is Stefan Sobachek. I think he, and if anyone knows this in the chat, Jonathan Bates in particular, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but um, I believe he really hard pruned black locust to like a super tight single leader, and he uses them as structure for, he does a lot of biological sprays. So it's, structure,
Cool.
it's not to hold a living thing. It's just to hold like tubing, which seems like an elegant solution to that too.
Yeah.
Okay, so techniques for overcoming farmers' skepticism, especially among farmers who do conventional soy, wheat, etc. What works to get them interested and ready to take the risk? This is a great question.
Love this question. I wish I had an answer for this. This is my life's work. This is what I'm committed to doing here in Central Illinois, where I live in the corn and soybean sea. Um, what's been successful for me so far is having leases available. The way that I've been able to work with row crop farmers is to rent them land within alley cropping systems where they have almost no risk, and I and Savanna Institute have all the risk. And so we're able to do this sort of work through multi-party partnerships where unlike our demonstration farm in Wisconsin, our Spring Green campus where we own the land, here in Illinois, we work with a network of landholders that lease their land to Savanna Institute. And then we sublease the areas where the row crop production is happening. At this point, because we don't, we're still in R&D mode with some of these larger grain systems specifically in the Midwest, where we know they're successful in Europe. They've been successful even in different parts of the US with nut production and grain alley cropping. With conventionally minded folks, they don't have any wiggle room for risk. They're already on the margins. They're very vulnerable to market and government changes. Their risk tolerance is different than someone that has a direct to market diversified system. Because it's like a catch-22, right? Like diversified small scale folks don't have access to things like crop insurance, which is bad. We need to be able to have insurance programs that are open to diversified growers. At the same time, those folks are able to make all types of decisions about what they can do on their land. They can kind of mitigate their own risk. They can make decisions on how to do that without outside intervention. Row crop farmers don't have that luxury if they're doing working with crop insurance programs or other subsidy or commodity programs. And so, or they have operating loans, which many farmers do. And so their kind of decision making and risk taking is not as wide. And so it's really up to those of us that can absorb risk to take on that risk and invite row crop farmers to work on it with us. So it's like an invitation to be part of the system, to understand what they need to do to make their side of things go, and then figuring out ways that we can co-create the system. But at the end of the day, they're not the ones putting their farm on the line. As we're getting the data, the best practices, the experiences up and going. And so, when folks ask, they're like, what do you recommend for row crop farmers? And to be very honest, at this point, I don't recommend it if you're going alone, unless you are really committed to doing this. And so shout out to my friend Dane Hunter, who is working with his family on a row crop farm in Southern Illinois. They're doing alley cropping. They are starting their alley cropping system. But it's really Dane, someone who's my age, that's doing all that heavy lifting and has a master's degree from U of I where he was studying agroforestry. So it's a challenging thing, but I want to work. This is what I want to do, is figure that out.
Oh, and I just, can just like hear how passionate you are about it. And it's really fun. Okay. So we've got 5 questions in 5 minutes. Let's do this.
Okay. Rapid fire. I'm bad at this, but we can do it.
And folks in the chat, please answer this if you know. Also, are you aware of, or can you point towards groups studying beneficial insect richness in association with alley cropping?
Yes. Well, there's a Jess Gamble at University of Wisconsin. We're putting together a couple of projects. So Eleanor is on here and is working with Jess and the lab that she's a part of at UW, specifically looking at agroforestry and alley cropping systems and bees and beneficial insects. So that's some upcoming work. Carmen Bluba at University of Illinois, who's part of the Diverse Corn Belt Project, is also studying this within the work that she's doing and has done some work within our demo farm systems here in Illinois. And then I'm sure there's others, but those are definitely 2 that we work with.
And I reckon you could follow up with Kaitie on email for that too. Okay. What factors are taken into account when deciding on north-south versus east-west?
Ooh, okay. I think people have differing opinions on north-south versus east-west. For me, north-south gives even shade on both sides. So that can be advantageous depending on your goals. West-east, you have more shade impact on one side than the other. And so it depends on your shade impact, any water or other kind of soil mitigation you want the alley cropping and the trees to do, and how that is going to transition over time. So I would say it depends.
Nailed it. Okay. Are there any considerations or adjustments made for herbicides used nearby? So assuming we're not wanting herbicide use in a system. Also, are any plants used for soil herbicides first.
Okay. For herbicides, in all of our subleases, we ban dicamba and 2,4-D. So no growth inhibitors can be used on the farm. That doesn't stop drift from coming from other places, but at least we control that. I'm interested in expanding that herbicide list to include things like atrazine and other chemicals that are damaging both to our soils and our water, as well as trying to get away from using coated seed, especially neonicotinoid seed. I think that is slowly going to happen, but I'm focused on relationship and trust building so that we can add more restrictions over time instead of all at once.
Nice. All right. I'm going to wrap these next two together. Someone's wondering about getting ground covers established under the trees, worrying about weeds taking over bare soil, or do you keep it clean and tilled under the trees, or are there plants you can use for chop and drop? What's the best strategy for keeping weeds out?
Yeah, it depends on your scale and your equipment. We try to put down the ground cover before we plant the trees. So for planting in, we either want to get that down a year before the trees go in, or if we're doing it in the same year, get it broadcast, either drilled the fall before or broadcast or via frost seeding before the trees go in. So it's coming up and doing that good weed suppression over time. For some of the trees, we're using herbicide bans. We also have used plastic weed mats as well as coco coir weed mats to keep the weed suppression down. And then, especially if you're transitioning from conventional ground, being able to do cover cropping for a full year before you do any of that helps with that weed suppression a lot, as well as reducing tillage or trying not to do a tillage pass right before planting. And then we tend to do a lot of mowing in the first couple of years to keep that down. Wood mulch is amazing if you can get it. Here in central Illinois, we don't really have many trees, so that's not an option for us.
All right, we are going to close it there. We did make it to one question, but I think it was a conversation for another day about grazing.
Email me.
Yeah.
I love to talk about alley cropping. I'll get my email back up here.
Thanks for everybody who noticed that there was a typo on my slides. GenRip is on the 17th, which is Monday. And you can reach Kaitie at Savannah-Institute.org. Don't forget, it's Kaitie. And thank you so much for being here, Kaitie. This was great. You are just a wealth of knowledge on this subject and many others. And like I said, your passion really shines through, and so does your experience. And it's wonderful to get to learn from you. So thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for the awesome questions. I wish I could spend more time with them, and come out and visit me in Urbana, Illinois. I would love to show you around the farms.
It's totally worth it. She toured me around there last summer and it was great. All right. Thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you next week.